There are many different ways to learn about the past. Some immerse themselves in the details of different eras by researching through various sources, while others take a fascinating journey through history together with us to better understand its most important aspects. One such aspect is a question that still generates many discussions. Why is there an ongoing debate around China and Taiwan? Even after decades, no one can reach a consensus. In China, the topic is considered a purely internal matter, and a discussion of it can cause a storm of indignation. In the United States, it is even more complicated. On the one hand, there is the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 and the more recent Reinforcement Act of 2020. At first glance, Americans seem to recognize the existence of the two Chinas, but visits or even phone calls by officials to Taiwan remain rare. And big companies like Blizzard are ready to penalize their employees for any mention of Hong Kong or Taiwan in any uncomfortable context. Why has such a confusing situation developed? How did the history of confrontation between Beijing and Taipei begin? Make yourself comfortable. We'll take it all in order. Many videos on this topic take viewers straight back to 1949, when China and Taiwan began their active confrontation. But to understand the roots of the conflict, you have to go much further back, to the Neolithic era, around 8,000 years before Christ. The territory of the modern Chinese province of Fujian was inhabited by members of the Austronesian people. These people were far ahead of their time. They were the first to invent the sail, which allowed them to explore the sea, and also create a prototype of primitive paper, opening up new possibilities for the exchange of information. They are the beginning of a history that millennia later would lead to the modern geopolitical divide. The Austronesians practiced agriculture and excelled in it. They cultivated a variety of crops, which allowed them to establish stable settlements and develop crafts. However, around the 5th millennium before Christ, their paths crossed with the more numerous Sino-Tibetan peoples, also known as Tibeto-Chinese. This encounter was a turning point. The Austronesians began the migration that would later go down in history as their Great Expansion. One of the first destinations of their migration was Taiwan. This island was a new territory for the ancient people. Although the first settlements of Austronesians in Taiwan appeared around 8000 BC, thanks to their technological advances, such as the use of sails, they not only developed Taiwan, but also began to populate vast areas of Oceania. Traces of their descendants can be found today in Indonesia, the Philippines, Polynesia, and even Madagascar. Taiwan remains the core of our story. Here, the Austronesians became the ancestors of the island's indigenous peoples. As of 2020, more than 500,000 people in Taiwan can be considered direct descendants of these prehistoric people. Despite this, China has not shown much interest in Taiwan for thousands of years. However, the island's strategic location and proximity to mainland China were bound to attract attention sooner or later. In the 3rd century Anno Domini, Taiwan is mentioned in Chinese chronicles as the Island of Barbarians. The first documented interaction between mainland China and Taiwan happened in 239, when an expeditionary corps of about 10,000 men was sent to the island. In 605, a similar operation was repeated. The indigenous people of the island were brought to the mainland, where they were taught Chinese and used in negotiations. However, there is not much reliable information about those times. What is known is that by the 7th century, there were settlements on the Penghu Islands and Taiwan, established by mainland Chinese and Japanese pirates who used these lands as bases for their operations. Taiwan remained a no-one's land, but its exploration was fraught with dangers. The indigenous people of the island were notorious for their militancy. There was a custom among them that a groom had to bring the head of a Chinese man to an elder to prove his maturity and right to marriage. In the 13th century, with the rise of the Mongols and the establishment of the Yuan dynasty, Chinese control extended to the Penghu Islands and part of Taiwan. This marked the beginning of mass migration to the island, primarily from the poorest areas of the mainland. Gradually, Taiwan's most fertile lands were occupied by settlers from Fujian and Guangdong provinces, who became the basis of the island's modern population. The indigenous people, pushed into the mountainous regions, began to lose their traditional lands. This process accelerated in the following centuries, especially during the era of European colonization, which brought new conflicts and hardships to Taiwan. However, the legacy of the early settlers continues to shape Taiwan's cultural and demographic landscape today. In 1517, Portuguese navigators sailed past the island, impressed by its natural beauty, and named it Formosa, which means beautiful. However, the Romanticism ended there. Soon, the island found itself at the center of a struggle between European powerhouses for control over the strategically important territory. The Dutch of the East India Company quickly joined the race for Taiwan, where they clashed with the Spanish. China fell out of the struggle for the island at that time. The conflict was won by the Dutch, who established their rule over Taiwan. But their rule was not long, only 20 years. Nevertheless, during this short term, they left a noticeable mark on the history of the island. The Dutch actively supported the resettlement of the Chinese in Taiwan, which led to the gradual displacement of the indigenous peoples. They also brought many innovations to the local economy. The Taiwanese first learned to use animals to work in the fields, and to use fertilizers, which significantly increased crop yields. Moreover, it was the Dutch who began to teach the locals to read and write, making the first steps towards the spread of writing on the island. However, the Dutch colonial policy was primarily profit-driven, as in other parts of the world. Harsh economic measures and disregard for the interests of the locals led to a series of uprisings. One of the most significant uprisings occurred in 1662, when forces led by supporters of the deposed Chinese Ming Dynasty overran Taiwan. This was the first time in history that a European colony came under the complete control of Asian forces. The takeover of Taiwan was also a major milestone in its political history. After the fall of the Ming Dynasty on the mainland, its supporters, including generals and nobles, fled to the island, where they proclaimed the independent state of Dongning, known in Europe as the Kingdom of Formosa. This episode was the first documented case of Taiwan declaring its independence, beginning a complex and controversial history that continues to this day. The year 1683 marked a turning point in Taiwan's history. After a brief period of independence under the Ming Dynasty, the island returned to Chinese control, this time under the Qing Dynasty. The Manchus reclaimed Taiwan through diplomatic and economic mechanisms, using the Dutch as intermediaries and imposing harsh sanctions. Since then, until 1895, Taiwan officially became part of mainland China. But things turned out to be far from clear-cut. For the Qing Empire, Taiwan remained nothing more than a periphery, a remote backwater of the great power. The island was not considered a strategically important territory, and its development remained neglected. However, the locals, especially the descendants of Ming supporters, saw the Manchus as invaders. Resistance was strong, and the traditions of the former rule lived on for a long time among the island's people. Meanwhile, in the 19th century, China faced threats on a much larger scale. The Opium Wars began when Great Britain, dissatisfied with China's refusal to trade in its drugs, organized a military coalition. The victory of the Western powerhouses led to chaos, famine, devastation, and a drug epidemic struck the Celestial Empire. During this period, Taiwan became the focus of attention of the Western powers, who saw it as a convenient springboard for political and military pressure on China. Taiwan's trade ties with Europe and Japan began to grow rapidly, and the island was becoming an increasingly important economic hub. China tried to catch up. In 1885, Taiwan received the status of a full-fledged province, which was accompanied by active reforms. The first railroad was built, ports were modernized, and infrastructure was improved. These achievements left a noticeable mark even in the modern history of Taiwan. But hopes for further development collapsed in 1894 when war broke out between China and Japan. Japan, with its rapidly growing military power, won, and Taiwan became a trophy. Under pressure from Western countries, China was forced to give the island to Japan. Although the Celestial Empire didn't accept the terms of the treaty, it was Japan's first colonization experience. Surprisingly, Japanese rule brought unexpected changes to Taiwan. In a few decades, the island became one of the most developed territories in Southeast Asia. Railroads, schools, hospitals, and modernized agriculture made Taiwan a model region. Despite the tragic pages, this period is considered the starting point of the island's transformation into one of the region's economic centers. By the time Taiwan was passed under Japanese control in 1895, there were only 50 kilometers of railroads on the island. However, under Japanese rule, the infrastructure began to develop rapidly. In the first decade, the length of railroad tracks increased to 500 kilometers. Taiwan underwent large-scale electrification, and new agriculture technologies appeared, which allowed the island to reach the international economic level by the First World War. Taiwan became one of the most modern territories in the region, and it maintained this status until World War II. Nevertheless, Japanese governance was far from gentle. Control over Taiwan was harsh and strict. There is an interesting fact in the history of the time. At a certain stage, the Japanese allowed elections for the Governor-General of the island, giving the locals a chance to participate in governance. However, this was more an illusion of self-government, as the real power remained in the hands of the Japanese administration. With the outbreak of World War II, everything changed. Japanese militarism and assimilation policies prevailed. Taiwanese people were actively Japanicized by imposing their language and culture. Moreover, they were mobilized into the Japanese army, which led to the participation of many islanders in tragic events, such as the Nanjing Massacre and other war crimes. However, with the end of the war, the majority of Taiwan's population supported the idea of the island's return to China. But the return of Taiwan turned out to be not so smooth. After Japan's surrender, the Potsdam Conference decided to pass the island to China. However, legally, the problem remained unresolved. Peace treaties with Japan were not signed until 1951, and China didn't even participate in the key San Francisco Treaty. This left the question of Taiwan's statehood in limbo. The island was left in uncertainty, which caused much controversy in the following years. On the mainland, chaos reigned as well. Since 1927, a civil war had been raging in China between the Republic of China and the Chinese Communists. This confrontation led to the destruction of the country and was actively supported by external powers. For example, Germany aided the Republic of China in the 1930s, while the USSR actively supported the Communists. Taiwan, like all of East Asia, found itself in the center of geopolitical intrigues, which predetermined its complex and ambiguous fate in the 20th century. After the war with Japan and World War II, China was in a state of total chaos, and internal divisions were put aside. However, as soon as the world conflict subsided, the old controversies returned with renewed vigor. As soon as Japan capitulated, the Communists and Republicans began a fight for influence, seeking to seize as much territory as possible to prove the legitimacy of their government. This was the first step in a new civil war that kept the country from recovering from the consequences of the World War. Eventually, the Communists, led by Mao Zedong, won, and their opponents, the Kuomintang representatives, led by Chiang Kai-shek, were forced to flee to Taiwan. Since 1949, while in Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek and his supporters effectively established a dictatorial regime that tightly controlled life on the island. First of all, Chiang Kai-shek proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of China in Taiwan, and right after that, he declared martial law, which lasted 38 years. This became the longest martial law ever and went down in history as the White Terror. Thousands of people suspected of being communist supporters were arrested, tortured, and executed. Strict censorship was imposed on the island, strikes were banned, and social and political freedoms were eliminated. This period of brutal repression was not the only source of tension. The second half of the 20th century was a time of constant clashes and conflict, with Taiwan and mainland China on the edge of war. In 1955, 58, and 1995, the world miraculously avoided a full-scale war between the two countries. Conflicts in those years nearly led to new armed clashes, but political tensions remained high for many years, determining Taiwan's fate for decades. The role of the United States in the events regarding Taiwan was decisive and multifaceted. After World War II, American experts were actively involved in the reconstruction of the island's economy and the investment process. One striking example of this was the successful agrarian reform project carried out by Wolf Gladzinski. This reform contributed to the overcoming of feudal structures and the establishment of market relations. In addition, the United States protected the island with its military might, which allowed the development of labor-intensive industries. In 1979, the United States adopted the important Taiwan Relations Act, which guaranteed the island military support in case of a conflict with China. At that time, Taiwan's representative spoke at the United Nations on behalf of China, as he was recognized as the official representative of the country. However, along with supporting the island, the world powerhouses could not ignore the growing potential of mainland China. In 1971, the People's Republic of China gained a seat at the United Nations, becoming the official representative of the Chinese people. Since then, Taiwan has repeatedly tried to challenge this status and has submitted several applications for membership, but all have been rejected under Chinese pressure. In response to these changes, the United States gradually shifted the focus of its policy toward Taiwan. Instead of explicit and unambiguous support of the island, the so-called policy of strategic ambiguity was introduced. America continued to support Taiwan on a non-official level, through embassies and representative offices in Western countries. However, officially, the U.S. recognized the People's Republic of China as China's sole legitimate representative, which caused a complicated political situation. This led to incidents such as the adoption of a new act on reinforcing relations with Taiwan in 2020, while the United States continued to hold official negotiations only with the People's Republic of China and prohibited its corporations from discussing the island's independence. The situation on the international stage remained tense and volatile, often fluctuating depending on the current relationship between the U.S. and China. The current situation established in the 1980s persists to this day, but it is becoming increasingly tense. China remains committed to the concept of a unified country, while Taiwan strives for official independence. The world is divided, with some supporting one side, others supporting the other, and some countries trying to balance their relationship with both sides, benefiting from both positions. Taiwan has become one of the world's leaders in semiconductors, electronics, and even nuclear power over the past decades. The island's economy has experienced the fastest growth rates and remains an important economic player on the world stage to this day. Although political tensions remain, Taiwan actively trades with mainland China, despite the fact that it does not officially contribute to the Chinese treasury. Trade turnover between the two countries continues to grow, strengthening their economic ties. At the same time, Taiwan's democratization process continues to evolve, with the termination of martial law in 1987, the first direct presidential election in 1996, and the weakening of the Kuomintang in the early 2000s. The island is moving toward greater political openness. However, in recent years, the situation has escalated again. Many countries are watching as the balance between the two Chinas is changing. The question of what will happen next remains open. Will Taiwan retain its autonomy in the face of increasing pressure from China? How will geopolitical processes in this region develop? These questions are of great importance for the future not only of Taiwan, but also of the entire world. If you're interested in this topic, we welcome your comments and likes. See you soon!